Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. I'm delighted to welcome Ruadhan Scrivener-Anderson. Ruadhan is a historian of late 19th and early 20th century Scotland. His PhD thesis focused on the commissioned officers of the Black Watch from around 1902 to 1908. He's currently undertaking research on the relationship between Victorian and Edwardian Scottish landed elites and the army. Today, Ruadhan will look at the selection, socialization and the development of group identity within the Black Watch in the lead up to the First World War. For our online audience, there'll be time for questions at the end of the discussion. For the online audience, you can post the questions in the chat bar and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk in person. Raise your hand, I'll come around with the microphone. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser, usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I'll now hand over to Ruadhan. I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk today about the commissioned officers of the British Army before and during the First World War, and to look at how they were selected and how new officers integrated in a period of war and a period of peace. Between the end of the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1902 and the signing of the Armistice in 1918, 1,861 of those officers were commissioned in the Black Watch, the senior Highland regiment of the British Army. And much of this talk relates to the officer corps as a whole, but I'm going to use that particular group as a case study, especially when talking about selection, so that we can see themes affecting the officers as a whole, as well as variation at the more local regimental level. So, let's look at who these men were and how they came to be officers. As I'll show later on, the regular officers commissioned before the First World War were predominantly drawn from higher status backgrounds, from the upper end of the social class spectrum. And from this, it seems logical to assume that they were chosen to be officers on the basis of their social class. Likewise, it might reasonably be assumed that those in a Scottish regiment like the Black Watch, the officers' national origins would be considered in selection as well. But when we look in detail at the selection process and uncover the criteria used and the people involved, as well as the wider social conditions surrounding the army officer's profession, it becomes clear that there was something a bit more complex going on. There were several main ways to obtain the King's Commission before the First World War. The most common route was to train at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst or the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. And as this is a case study of an infantry regiment, I'll mainly focus on Sandhurst, where infantry officers were trained. Alternatively, candidates could become officers in the part-time auxiliary forces, either the militia, which in 1908 became the Special Reserve, or the volunteer force, which then became the territorial force, and then applied to transfer to the regular army. A smaller proportion of commissions were available to university students who could enter the army directly after receiving military training alongside their degree. A small number of ordinary soldiers were also promoted to be officers, and an even smaller number of candidates trained at foreign military colleges. But those numbers are so small that I won't really discuss them too much here. In all of these entry routes, the main criterion assessed was education. Cadetships at Sandhurst were technically open to anyone, regardless of class, but admission was contingent on passing an entrance exam in academic subjects, set at the same level as that required to matriculate at a university. There were a limited number of candidates admitted on the subjective recommendation of the Army Council, the overall authority of the Army, but the majority competed for entry at that open examination. The exam was held by the Civil Service Commissioners rather than the Army, the body who held the admission exams for the civil service. So that meant that no candidate could be given preferential treatment by existing officers. However, while the syllabus of the examination was under constant review, the examinations generally covered a wide range of subjects, including classical languages, and generally favoured the traditionally educated candidates from independent or public schools and some grammar schools. And so while it was technically an open competition, the Sandhurst route predominantly supplied the army with what we might consider upper middle or upper class candidates. Those candidates then trained at Sandhurst for 12 to 18 months and sat another series of examinations, this time in military subjects, to qualify for their commissions. Candidates from the auxiliary forces looking to transfer to the regular army also required a high level of education. It was comparatively easy to join the auxiliary forces as an officer, but it still required a school leaving certificate or equivalent qualification. To qualify for a regular commission, they also underwent a further series of exams, which were essentially a hybrid of the entry and final exams at Sandhurst, so a broad general education was essential. The army viewed an undergraduate degree as sufficient evidence of education without any further examination, hence the practice of directly commissioning university students and graduates. But the university route was unique in that it did involve an element of subjective selection. Dedicated units of the auxiliary forces, known as officer training corps, provided military training to students in their spare time, and candidates undertook practical and written exams in military subjects. But after that, it was left to a selection board to decide whether or not the candidate should be commissioned. But interestingly, that board was almost entirely made up of representatives of the universities, with only 1 or 2 representatives of the Army and the War Office allowed. So it was essentially the universities who made these subjective decisions about who became officers in the Army. So generally, it's clear that education was the main objective factor assessed in the initial selection of officers. The social origins of the candidates were not specifically assessed at any point, except perhaps at those university selection boards. Nonetheless, the intellectual requirements meant that the majority of successful candidates were privately educated. After obtaining the King's Commission, infantry officers then entered competition for appointment to a regiment. This is a process which has not received a great deal of attention from historians, largely because many have assumed that, like today, regiments were essentially allowed to choose the officers they wanted from the pool of qualified candidates. But in fact, in the Edwardian period, the decision as to which regiment a candidate was appointed to was made by a single individual, the military secretary to the Secretary of State for War, an officer of the rank of Major General who was responsible for the administration of the officers' careers. He was faced with an impossible problem. The army as a whole was under strength, but a slow system of promotion meant that there were only 1 or 2 vacancies for new officers in each regiment per year. Some regiments were more popular than others, and in the case of the Black Watch and the other Highland regiments, there were always far more applicants than vacancies. Candidates filled out a form listing 3 regiments that they would like to be appointed to in order of preference, but the military secretary was never able to give every candidate the regiment they wanted. Ultimately, someone had to go to the less popular English county regiments. So he made his decision based on 2 objective factors. First, he considered the candidates' claims. Claims were the connections which the candidates had to the regiment, which could either be regimental claims, which were family connections, such as a father or an uncle serving in the regiment, or territorial claims, which were links to the regiment's recruiting area or where its depot was, so if they were lived or were born within the recruiting area. And that raises 2 important points. The claim system took into account family connections, but it wasn't nepotism in that sense. And secondly, officers in the Black Watch were likely to be born or reside in Scotland, but being Scottish itself didn't constitute a claim, as it only applied to specific counties, in the case of the Black Watch, Perthshire, Dundee, Forfarshire and Fife. Where candidates for the same regiment were otherwise evenly matched, the military secretary then considered a second factor, their performance in the commissioning exams. Candidates were ranked according to these exams in what was known as the Order of Merit, and giving a clear and objective deciding factors where vacancies were limited. It was a very simple system, and it was objectively the fairest. It was impossible to give every candidate their preference, and to make an exception for some would only disadvantage others. But although the selection process was governed by strict regulations, this didn't prevent regiments and the candidates' parents from attempting to influence the military secretary's decision. Throughout the period, senior regimental officers wrote to the military secretary, attempting to persuade him to give them the candidates they wanted, but it very rarely worked. It didn't matter who a candidate was or how much a regiment may want him, If there was no vacancy, that was the bottom line. In 1911, the regulations regarding first appointments to regiments were republished with specific reference to this problem, stating for the information of candidates, it is a mistake to imagine that the personal or written applications of his relatives or friends will in any way further his chance. So the process of officer selection at these two stages before the First World War became an almost entirely objective process based on a few specific criteria. Initial entry was overwhelmingly governed by objective examination, and appointments to regiments were allocated by a single individual with only a very limited knowledge of the candidates. While socioeconomic background was not formally assessed, either in obtaining a commission or securing appointment to a regiment, there was another factor which shaped the composition of the officer corps. Becoming an officer entailed a significant financial outlay, which inevitably limited entry to the profession. As we've seen, the educational requirements made an expensive private education practically essential, although scholarships were available for many schools and state-aided institutions were beginning to expand their curricula. But even assuming perhaps a candidate received a free education and succeeded in the entrance examinations for Sandhurst, the expense of obtaining a commission was only beginning. Like all tertiary education institutions, attendance at Sandhurst and Woolwich in this period required payment of substantial fees. To take the example of Sandhurst, this was up to £150 per year, which adjusted for inflation would be roughly £21,000 today. And the course varied from 12 to 18 months in length. There were some circumstances in which those fees were reduced, but in 1910 the average contribution per cadet was £110. And the expense which inevitably deterred less wealthy potential officers did not end there. The career itself, or at least the first years in the profession, were a constant drain on cash. The first major expense was the cost of uniform and other items necessary to join the regiment. And this is where things become a bit more complicated. It was more expensive to join some regiments than others. The cavalry regiments were generally the most expensive, and at the other end of the spectrum, some county infantry regiments and corps such as the Army Service Corps were much less expensive, requiring much lower expenditure on uniform and equipment. The Black Watch sat somewhere in the middle as one of the more expensive line infantry regiments. The total cost of a Black Watch officer's complete uniform and equipment from the suppliers that the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion would ideally like everyone to buy it from was £128, 15 shillings and threepence, which would be around £18,500 today. There were some cheaper options from the Army and Navy Cooperative Society or from Edinburgh tailors, but it's obvious that the purchase of uniform and equipment represented a significant financial barrier to service in general, and particularly to the higher status and more extravagantly equipped regiments. And the expense didn't end there. Once an officer had joined his regiment, the various expenses his career entailed made it almost impossible for him to live on his pay, the rate of which had not been increased since 1806. As the Adjutant General, Sir Ian Hamilton, commented in 1909, officers take out their salaries partly in cash, partly in security of tenure and in social position. Here again, the cost of living varied widely depending on the regiment or corps, and the extent to which the individual officer participated in voluntary aspects of regimental life. As a general guide, though, a report produced in 1903 by Lord Stanley estimated that an infantry officer at the outset of his career required an annual private income in addition to his pay of £60 a year, round about £9,000, which covered everything from his mess bills to sporting pursuits. There were ways to manage the cost of uniform and the cost of living. While the uniform required by new officers joining the Black Watch was very expensive, there were ways around that. For example, Robert Anstruther, who joined the Black Watch in 1909, got a vacancy because an officer resigned, and that officer kindly sold his kit to him at a reduced rate. Provided they could pass that initial financial threshold presented by commissioning and the purchase of uniform, the cost of living could be reduced by obtaining a posting to a battalion in India, where it was often possible for an officer to live on his pay, or going on secondment to something like the Egyptian Army or the West African Frontier Force with higher rates of pay and lower cost of living. But if one wished to serve primarily as a regimental officer in the home battalion in the UK, where the cost of living was higher, a private income was basically essential. and that inevitably affected the backgrounds of officers in the army as a whole, and also to some extent dictated whether a candidate would express a preference for a higher status and often more expensive regiment, or apply for appointment to a less prestigious or cheaper unit, creating further inconsistency in the background of officers between regiments. So, the results of this. Unsurprisingly, most officers were privately educated. But if we look at the occupations of the officers' fathers, we can see that they encompass quite a broad section of relatively higher status families, which included both social climbers and the traditional elite. Around 27% of officers came from military families, with their fathers serving as regular army or naval officers. And that's undoubtedly due in part to the claims system, with candidates from Black Watch families being much more likely than others to gain appointment to the regiment, although that's percentage is lower in the Black Watch than it is for the rest of the army, and I still don't actually know why. But we also see quite a large proportion in this period of officers coming from the professional and entrepreneurial middle class. The aristocracy and landed gentry, the traditional elite who might be expected to become officers, made up a smaller but not inconsiderable proportion compared with that professional upper middle class majority. And finally, there were also a small number of manual and lower management occupations, which exclusively represent officers commissioned from the enlisted ranks. So there's not very many of them. So the majority of officers were drawn from what we might consider upper middle class backgrounds. They cannot be considered a cross-section of society, but neither were they the social elite. Perhaps surprisingly, their national origins were quite varied. If you can't read everything on these slides, the blue bit is Scottish. So, territorial claims gave some, but not all, Scots an advantage in selection for the regiment, but it didn't exclude others. 30% of officers commissioned into the Black Watch between 1902 and 1914 were born in England, and 39% resided there permanently until they joined the army. Another considerable proportion, 34%, were born in other countries, including British dominions and the Empire. A small number had also been living overseas on a long-term basis when they were commissioned. But 53% lived in Scotland, and that probably indicates the impact of territorial claims, with people living within the counties of the regimental district being more likely to gain appointment to the regiment. But nationality itself was not a criterion for selection. And then, of course, everything changed. The outbreak of the First World War saw the creation of a national army from civilian volunteers and later conscripts, and the officer corps underwent a similar expansion. In addition, the early months of the war saw heavy casualties amongst the regular officers. The exigencies of war required new leaders to be produced quickly, and this inevitably required changes in the sources and in the process of selection, and as a result in the composition of the group. The Army Council had made some plans for this before the war, and their first action was to grant commissions to a large number of enlisted soldiers. These men had been identified as potential officers by their commanding officers before the war, and now around 2,000 of them were commissioned en masse. In addition, the Army continued to draw new officers from Sandhurst, the universities and the auxiliary forces, with largely the same initial selection as before. And that provided initial replacements for casualties, but far more officers were required. The Army was reluctant to grant more commissions, though, as that would create a large surplus of officers who would stay on after the war and still have to be paid. Therefore, the War Office introduced temporary commissions, which could be granted for the duration of hostilities only, which facilitated the expansion of the officer corps without a problematic peacetime surplus. Crucially, for the conduct of officer selection and appointments, this meant that the limitation on the number of vacancies for officers in all of these infantry regiments was lifted. Naturally, the appointment of temporary officers on this scale would have overwhelmed the military secretary, who essentially ran a department of 2 people. So the responsibility was devolved. Initially, in fact before war had even been declared, the vice-chancellors of universities were asked to nominate students and graduates for commissions. In addition, prospective officers could apply to the commanding officers of regimental depots, the headquarters of regiments within their recruiting areas. And they were given the power to recommend candidates for commissions. All the commissions still ultimately had to be approved by the military secretary, but it was a huge change from the pre-war situation. And most notably, it allowed senior regimental officers, the depot commanders, to select their own officers for the first time. That power was then further extended, under the direction of Secretary of State for War Herbert Kitchener, multiple new armies were raised, each essentially a duplicate of the pre-war regular army. The first of these armies sourced most of its officers from the universities and the depots, but in the subsequent armies raised, the commanding officers of individual battalions were allowed to choose many of their own officers. So for the first time, senior regimental officers were given this authority on a large scale, to choose officers directly from civilian life. It gave them an unprecedented opportunity to discriminate on grounds of social class and nationality when choosing these new officers. On the other hand, so many were required that they couldn't afford to be too selective. This all had several important effects on the composition of the officer corps. From the beginning of the war, the influx of officers promoted from the enlisted ranks led to substantial social diversity amongst the regular officers holding permanent commissions, those who would stay on after the war. Former enlisted soldiers, all drawn from working class backgrounds, made up almost a third of all permanent regular Black Watch officers by 1918. But the regiment continued to receive a steady stream of new officers from the traditional sources, particularly Sandhurst, which meant that many of the permanent officers were from the same upper middle class background as their pre-war colleagues, although a far lower proportion were now coming from being sons of regular officers. The exigencies of war also had a significant impact on the national origins of those permanent officers. As the military secretary attempted to send permanent officers where they were most needed, often without considering claims, the number of Scots sent to the Black Watch decreased. Only 41% of permanent officers commissioned in wartime lived in Scotland, and just 34% were born there. The largest single group, defined either by country of birth or residence, were English. And if we discount the officers promoted from the ranks, the majority of whom were Scottish by birth, it becomes even clearer that appointments from Sandhurst were being made with very little reference to claims, sometimes granting candidates preferences, but more often simply subject to the needs of the service. In contrast, the temporary officers were much more likely to be Scottish, with around 60% of those commissioned between 1914 and 1916 born in and residing in Scotland, illustrating the impact of allowing the regiments to choose their officers compared with the more pragmatic decisions of the military secretary. The occupational backgrounds of those temporary officers in the early years of the war reflect the focus on education, but also the relaxation of the pre-war standard, which favoured the privately educated. And as a result, large numbers of temporary officers were now drawn from middle-class backgrounds, particularly the traditional professions, but also from clerical or administrative occupations. In a Scottish regiment particularly, we find a large proportion who were educated at state-aided schools under the Scotch Education Department, which were unable to provide sufficient preparation for the pre-war army entrance exams. I've only covered the temporary officers in the first 2 years of the war there, because the early process of selection soon became problematic. These temporary officers were chosen directly from civilian backgrounds, and while they were often well educated, most had received no military training. In addition, there were inevitably a number who were appointed due to personal connections to existing officers, or simply on the basis of their social background. Unsurprisingly, therefore, many proved to be quite bad at the job, but once the King's Commission had been granted, it was very hard to dismiss an officer. So in February 1916, the Army formed Officer Cadet Battalions, or OCBs, dedicated units which would turn potential officers into leaders. From that point on, only men who had first served as enlisted soldiers and then passed through a 4-month course at an OCB would be granted temporary commissions. Regiments could recommend candidates to attend the OCBs, but otherwise they didn't have a role in selection anymore. Military efficiency and leadership potential, qualities which could not be measured by class or education, became the key factor in choosing officers. Successful candidates could state a preference for up to 3 regiments, as before the war. The military secretary's department, which had massively grown by this point, generally seems to have tried to grant these preferences where possible. But this was still with the caveat that all appointments were subject to the needs of the service, and many applications surviving in the National Archives show the military secretary overruling candidates' preferences, in many cases literally crossing out the name of the regiment and writing another one. This had a significant effect on both the social and national origins of the officers. The officer corps became more diverse in terms of social class than ever, as large numbers of working and lower middle class men serving in the ranks were granted commissions. Some level of education, or at least literacy, remained essential. And so for the first time, we see the number of men drawn from clerical occupations growing and surpassing the number from the professional middle class. It might be expected that just as the social composition of the group diversified, the national composition would too. But counterintuitively, the number of officers born and residing in Scotland went up. That took me by surprise a bit when I first compiled the statistics, and it was immediately clear that that could only be the result of a deliberate policy from the Military Secretary's Department. Unfortunately, the records of that were destroyed during the Blitz in 1940, and we don't have the regulations that led to that trend. What we do know is that in 1916, in an effort to promote cohesion and esprit de corps, the Adjutant General, Sir Neville Macready, insisted that as far as possible, Scots and Welshmen should be sent to their national affiliated regiments. And we knew that that applied to conscripts, but we can now be pretty certain that the same policy applied to officers. We can see here a clear spike in the proportion of Scottish-born and resident officers compared to other nationalities in 1917 when that practice properly came into effect. Essentially, if a Scottish-born officer expressed a preference for a Scottish regiment, he was almost certain to get it. And this really is why I think it's so important to utilise case studies like this of individual units in looking at a process like officer selection. We can talk about the officer corps of the British Army as a whole, and it can be tempting to view it as one entity that was essentially uniform. We can view broad trends across the army, notably that increasingly diverse socioeconomic background of new officers. But in reality, the evolution of officer selection and first appointments was more complex, with variation at national and regimental level, even after the introduction of standardised initial selection and training. Over the whole period, 1902 to 1918, the Army's leadership was fairly consistently organised based on local and national affiliations of individual officers. And that perhaps calls into question the usefulness of the concept of the officer corps, or the quintessential abstract figure of the British officer, given the divisions inherent in the regimental system. That said, although the proportion of Scots in the regiment increased, there was still a large number who were not Scottish, by either birth or naturalisation, at least 549 who were not born in Scotland. Indeed, 1916 saw the first non-white officer commissioned in the regiment. So by 1918, the officers of the Black Watch as a whole were a pretty mixed group, with increased diversity in terms of both social and national background. However, having just questioned the concept of the officer corps and the quintessential British officer, I will now argue completely the opposite. Throughout the war, the officer corps maintained a consistent character and ethos, and continuity from the pre-war period to the Armistice. The defining feature of the British officer in the early 20th century was his social status. The character of the officer corps was that of the gentleman, its ethos summarised by the concept of noblesse obligée, the responsibility of the privileged elite to provide leadership for the common people. The general trend across the period 1902 to 1918 was towards a more diverse, democratised officer corps, but despite this, the status associated with the profession was not significantly diminished. Somehow, men from disparate backgrounds maintained the traditional character of the officer corps, and I want to spend the last part of this talk looking at how this was done. In sociological terms, the officer corps was a status group. Distinct from a socioeconomic class, a status group refers to a group of people who are judged by outsiders, those out with the group, to have a uniform level of social status. That level of status is judged from what those outsiders can see of the group, at the most basic level based on their lifestyle and conduct. This idea was popularized by German sociologist Max Weber around the time of the First World War, but British thinkers, and indeed army officers, were having the same ideas at that time. In 1899, the British officer and commentator W.E. Cairns stated that when properly integrated into his regiment, an officer became a member of a large family who may have their little private differences, but who present an unbroken front to the outside world. The officers of the British Army were a status group, and their social status relied more on the lifestyle and behaviour they shared than the classes from which they recruited. In other words, the officer corps of the First World War was a social reality, born of accepted ideas and behaviours, rather than the sum of its members' individual origins. In addition, the adoption of a particular lifestyle and behaviour of the status group was a process of socialization which allowed new officers to integrate, to adopt the shared identity of the group. In short, it was possible to alter one's individual social status, in effect to become a gentleman through service as an officer. We can identify the core aspects of lifestyle and behaviour which contributed to the perceived status of the officer corps very clearly, none of which really required individual officers to be born into high-status families. Before the war, the officers' everyday lives incorporated displays of status which promoted a sense of uniformity and homogeneity. In terms of material culture, at the most basic level, the uniforms they wore were a symbol of elevated status. The expensive materials and rank insignia were recognisable throughout the empire, immediately marking the officer out as a member of an exclusive high-status group. Accordingly, the officer himself could be affirmed of his belonging to that group. In addition, most officers lived in the officers' mess, a building comprising the officers' living quarters. This close proximity itself aided group cohesion, but the officers' mess was more than simply a place to socialise. The lifestyle and material culture of the place also served to promote the appearance of elevated social status and in turn the sense of social homogeneity which was central to group identity. Like the officer's uniform, the physical premises of the mess incorporated obvious displays of status. The basic physical building consisted of a dining room and anteroom, allowing the officers to socialise in comfortable and often lavish surroundings. You can see in the image here what the officers' mess of the first Black Watch looked like just before the First World War, displaying silver plate, artwork, and items of historical significance to the regiment. Essentially, it looked a lot like the grand country houses that one might expect an Edwardian officer to inhabit. Another important aspect of the officer's lifestyle was sports and games. There was an important distinction between games and sports which were consistent with the status of an officer and a gentleman and those which were not. And the regular Black Watch officers before the war tended towards games traditionally associated with the social elite, such as rugby, polo, cricket, and golf. Perhaps more importantly, all pre-war officers participated in sports, meaning hunting, shooting, and fishing. Pursuits which were inextricably associated with the aristocracy and gentry. The very nature of field sports, requiring large areas of land, maintained an inevitable association with the landed elites, and thus with power and wealth. Sport was often a way for those of humbler backgrounds to associate themselves with the traditional rural elite, and officers whose families owned country estates frequently invited less affluent officers to hunt, shoot, and fish during their leave. Advantage was also taken of any posting to areas where such activities could be carried out. Such was the enthusiasm for this activity that while providing the Guard of Honour for King George V's stay at Balmoral in 1912, in 7 weeks, 4 officers accounted for 1,806 grouse, 16 black game, 151 hares, and 9 stags from the royal estate. As I mentioned earlier, the lifestyle of the officers' mess, these lavish living quarters, aristocratic hobbies, and fancy uniforms, was a very expensive lifestyle. Some form of private income was generally necessary if one wished to serve at home as an infantry officer. However, while we've seen that this expense did shape the socio-economic backgrounds from which the officers were sourced before the Great War in a similar manner to the educational requirements, we shouldn't overestimate the effects of this. The impression of social homogeneity presented by the status group belied the true social background and financial situation of the individual. Participation in the lifestyle of the gentleman indicated that this was an officer's inherent position in life. That meant that social climbers, for example officers from new money families and business who were keen to establish themselves amongst the social elite and who could afford to participate in that lifestyle, could act the part of the gentleman and benefit from the associated status. But that became a continual source of complaint amongst serving officers and army reformers in the period. In 1902, the politician Leopold Amery commented, "How many brainless sons of wealthy parvenus enter the cavalry simply and solely for the social connections they hope to acquire." Conversely, it could also work in favour of the less wealthy established elite. Despite the relative expense of service as an officer, obtaining a commission was often a means for the members of the ailing aristocracy to maintain their social position in the absence of wealth, land, or power. And likewise, the gentry and established professional classes faced the same concern. Ironically, at the same time when Leopold Amery was complaining about the influx of social climbers, his own brother, Harold, was in quite the opposite situation, attempting to hold on to his social position as an impecunious officer in the Black Watch. As the second son of a civil servant, Captain Harold Amery was born into upper middle class respectability, but not wealth, and he struggled with the financial demands of the profession throughout his career. By 1914, he was unable to pay his mess bills, and when he was appointed a company commander and required to buy a new pair of riding boots, he got into debt in order to keep up appearances. Unfortunately, you can't see very clearly in this photo, but he's the company commander in the centre on horseback here, and he's actually carrying a different type of sword to the officers on either side of him because he couldn't afford to buy the new one he needed. But ultimately, he succeeded in keeping up appearances more or less and maintained his status as an officer, ensuring his membership of the group. The luxurious lifestyle of the officers' mess should thus be viewed with the caveat that it often involved a degree of social posturing, which concealed the impecuniousness and relatively humble social origins of some members. But the estimation of status it achieved in the eyes of external observers was very real. Those who conformed to the required standards, by whatever means, ensured their acceptance by their fellow officers and shared in the status of the group. The material culture of the officer corps was perhaps the most obvious way in which the status of the group was displayed, but their personal conduct was equally important. As Cairns put it, officers might have private differences, but they presented an unbroken front to the outside world. The elevated social status of the officer was maintained by strict adherence to a behavioural code. Essentially, they were expected to act like gentlemen, to be polite, courteous, upstanding members of society, exemplifying values of integrity, honour, and of course, noblesse oblige. But there were inevitably occasions upon which officers let the side down, failed to uphold those standards, and conducted themselves in a manner which did not befit their social status. Misconduct on the part of a single officer had the potential to break the unbroken front, and so to diminish the reputation of the entire group. With the status of the group depending on the conduct of each individual, therefore, the officers were held to account by their peers, and behaviour which did not conform to the ideal of the gentleman was met with informal punishment, including, in the extreme, expulsion from the group. Instances which had the most potential to cause damage to the officer's reputation usually related to romantic relationships, and the standard reaction was to disassociate the offending individual from the regiment. For example, 2nd Lieutenant James Haig was commissioned in the regiment in 1907. He resigned his commission around a year later, and we know that his resignation was encouraged and perhaps even enforced by the other officers, with one fellow officer commenting that they were getting rid of some undesirables. Shortly after this, in November 1908, the reason became clear, as Haig boarded a ship bound for Australia, sharing a cabin with a married woman some 18 years his senior. The other officers were still affected by the scandal. In 1910, the Dundee Courier broke the story, Black Watch officer in divorce court. Nonetheless, Haig's preemptive resignation and the 2-year delay lessened the impact. So the pre-war officers were very aware that the unbroken front on which their social position depended was constantly in the public view. Moreover, they had little, if any, say in the selection of new officers, so this self-policing essentially became a final form of selection, giving the regiment some control over officering. Those who conformed were judged as socially acceptable by the other officers, and those who fell short of the mark were disciplined or expelled. The outbreak of the First World War and the expansion and necessary diversification of the officer corps represented a serious threat to the status of the profession. Even though the officers' lifestyle and behaviour created a false or real sense of social homogeneity before the war, the pre-war officers still had largely been drawn from the upper middle class, and so diversification on the scale seen in the First World War was unprecedented. Yet, by 1918, the social character of the group was not appreciably altered. Officers commissioned from humble social backgrounds earned the initially derisive and later self-styled title of temporary gentlemen. For the pre-war officers, conformity was an integral aspect of their career, essential to their maintaining their position in the profession, and without which they risked being forced to leave. On the other hand, wartime officers, though largely holding temporary commissions, enjoyed a far greater level of security. Their country needed them. And secure in that knowledge, for many wartime officers, the prescribed lifestyle could seem senseless, and pressure to conform proved frustrating. senior officers who pressed new officers to conform appeared overbearing or ridiculous. But they had a point. The leadership of any unit was in a constant state of change throughout the war. Officers joined, went on leave, became casualties, or were transferred or promoted on a regular basis. And as we've seen, the socio-economic origins of the group were increasingly diverse. Emulating the pre-war model of the quintessential British officer helped to establish a thread of continuity and consistency in leadership, which it was proven by long experience that the soldiers under their command responded to. This has been observed by several historians in relation to consistency in the style of personal leadership on the battlefield seen throughout the war, but I think we should appreciate that this continuity affected every aspect of the wartime officers' lives. And while many officers initially found the transition difficult, eventually conformity to the model of the officer and the gentleman could help even the most objectionable individuals to integrate, and even to promote the same lifestyle and sense of continuity amongst the new officers who came after them. Not all wartime officers immediately recognized the importance of behaving like a gentleman. The strict behavioral code seemed old-fashioned or arbitrary under wartime conditions, and so senior officers were keen to enforce it. The training provided at OCBs even included etiquette lessons in order to aid the integration of new officers from disparate social backgrounds. But ultimately, the conservative standard of the pre-war army could not be wholly maintained. The threat of expulsion just didn't carry the same weight in wartime, because every trained officer was needed, and officers were unlikely to resign due to the social implications of shirking one's duty in wartime. Wartime officers participated in activities which were frowned upon in the pre-war army: riding motorcycles, walking out with young ladies, and appearing in public inebriated. In perhaps the most extreme instance, an oral history recorded by the Imperial War Museum in the 1960s mentions a Black Watch officer openly consorting with a prostitute while on leave in India, apparently without consequence. But while there was some relaxation under wartime conditions, largely overseas and at the front, informal discipline and peer pressure continued to function as before the war, particularly amongst officers serving at home. The shame of resignation in wartime was often avoided by encouraging officers to give up their commissions to serve in the ranks. For example, Charles Gordon was accused of being over-familiar with the enlisted men and failing to behave in a manner which enforced the social divide between enlisted and commissioned ranks. Under pressure from his commanding officer, he resigned, but re-enlisted as a private soldier in the same battalion. In some cases, the crime was considered too serious to allow this, and the regiment had to completely disassociate itself from the offender. Notably, Guy Addison was dismissed and imprisoned for homosexuality, but the reason for his dismissal was not disclosed and scandal was avoided. Similarly, one officer was dismissed for drunkenness and absence without leave, and his request to serve in the ranks was denied. As a result, overall, the gentlemanly ethos prevailed, and wartime officers learned to appreciate its value. Thus, they maintained an apparent standard of behaviour which separated them from the rank and file, and the social status of the profession endured. Perhaps the clearest demonstration of the effectiveness of these practices in maintaining the social character of the profession is the frequency with which wartime officers, subject themselves to pressure to conform, in turn became the harshest judges of social acceptability. Individuals from even the humblest social backgrounds, who might only have become officers and adopted the prescribed lifestyle and behaviour at the behest of their peers a few months earlier, could soon develop a sense of superiority over new officers. Such attitudes were often born of the officer's own insecurity in their newfound position. As Lieutenant Hamish Mann commented, in some cases the officer of humble social origins thinks he ought to show his superiority to other mortals by going to the other extreme. And we can see this clearly in the case of Lieutenant Philip Paul, who served alongside Mann in the 11th Battalion, the Black Watch. For Paul, the social background and associated behaviour of many fellow officers became a continual source of complaint. He wrote in 1915, quote, "A lot of men here who have blossomed out into temporary second lieutenants and by God's grace temporary gentlemen haven't yet had the sharp corners rubbed off," end quote. But even that suggests that he believed these officers had the potential to change their character, to become more socially acceptable by having those sharp corners rubbed off. Eventually, those officers too might embody this character and ethos of the officer, might very well cultivate similar attitudes towards newcomers. This force of reaction, as Mann put it, is a clear indication of socialization at work. Providing the army with leaders in preparation for and during the First World War was a constantly evolving and complex process. A general trend can be observed towards the democratization of commissioning and the diversification of the officer body in response to the exigencies of war, although there was always a secondary consideration of nationality in the provision of officers for nationally affiliated regiments. Nonetheless, despite the diversification of the individual officers' origins, the endurance of the traditional character of the officer corps, and the elevated social status of the profession, and the social divide between officers and other ranks is striking. Before and during the war, the officers were a status group drawn from a variety of backgrounds but adhering to a lifestyle and behaviour which accorded them a uniform estimation of social status in the eyes of outsiders. This shared experience facilitated integration and a sense of belonging, creating a cycle whereby new members conformed to the lifestyle of the group and in turn became exponents of that lifestyle. Conversely, failure to conform could lead to alienation or even expulsion. Thus, membership of the officer corps could shape both the individual status in the eyes of others and how they perceived themselves. Regardless of their individual origins, I think officers could become gentlemen, at least temporary ones. Right, thank you very much. I'll stop there.